What if I told you that before pharmaceutical companies existed, before medical schools taught biochemistry, and before the first hospital was built on American soil, Native American healers had already assembled one of the most sophisticated botanical pharmacopoeias in human history? Across hundreds of distinct nations, from the Haudenosaunee of the Northeast to the Diné of the Southwest, medicine people spent thousands of years observing how plants interacted with the human body. They documented their findings, not in journals, but in oral traditions, ceremonial knowledge, and carefully taught apprenticeships that passed from generation to generation with extraordinary precision. Modern ethnobotanists who study these traditions are not discovering new things. They are catching up to knowledge that was already mature long before Columbus set foot on this continent. And now, peer-reviewed science is confirming what these healers knew with a level of molecular specificity that would have felt miraculous to early Western physicians. I'm about to show you 20 plants that will change the way you think about healing forever. Before we get into the full list, let me give you a taste of what is coming. Around number 11, we are going to talk about a plant the Lakota used specifically to pull infection out of deep tissue wounds, a practice so effective that field medics during certain frontier conflicts quietly borrowed it. Modern immunology has since identified the exact polysaccharide responsible for that action. And by the time we reach number 20, you will understand why one small flowering plant may hold the most dramatic gap between ancient genius and modern neglect of anything on this list. If this kind of ancestral wisdom is what you come here for, subscribe right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video like this one. These are 20 forgotten Native American plants that the modern world is finally beginning to understand as life-changing medicine. Echinacea was used by more than a dozen Plains nations, including the Cheyenne and the Omaha, who prepared cold water infusions of the root and applied them directly to snake bites, infected wounds, and throat pain. The Omaha specifically recorded using it for toothache by holding the macerated root against the gum, sometimes for hours at a stretch. How did they know this unremarkable purple coneflower had anything to offer at all? Clinical studies now document that Echinacea purpurea and Echinacea angustifolia both stimulate macrophage activity through a compound called alkylamides, which bind to cannabinoid receptors and modulate the innate immune response. Research from the University of Connecticut meta-analyzed 14 clinical trials and found statistically significant reductions in both cold incidence and duration among adults who used standardized Echinacea preparations. The root was traditionally dried and used as a tea or chewed directly. Today, tinctures made from the fresh root are considered the most bioavailable preparation. Echinacea faded from American medicine after the rise of antibiotics in the 1940s, when physicians believed chemical drugs had made plant medicine redundant. It was a commercial decision as much as a scientific one. But this prairie flower never stopped working. It was simply waiting for the science to catch up. Golden seal grew throughout the woodlands of the eastern United States, and the Cherokee used it to treat inflammatory conditions of the mucous membranes, mixing the dried root with bear grease to make a salve for skin infections. The Iroquois made strong root decoctions to wash infected eyes. Here is what most people miss. The compound berberine, which gives golden seal its distinctive yellow color, has been studied extensively by researchers at the University of Michigan, who found it inhibits the adhesion of bacteria to epithelial cells at the molecular level. It does this by disrupting the quorum-sensing signals that bacteria use to organize into biofilms. The traditional preparation was a root powder mixed with hot water or applied as a poultice. For internal use today, capsules with standardized berberine content are widely available. Golden seal declined in mainstream medicine largely because it could not be patented, and a non-patentable plant generates no licensing revenue for pharmaceutical development. The irony is that berberine is now one of the most heavily studied natural compounds in metabolic medicine. Golden seal did not fade because it stopped working. It faded because no one could own it. Yerba mansa grew along the waterways of the southwestern desert, and the Cahuilla people of California used every part of it, roots, leaves, and seeds, for respiratory infections, skin ulcers, and fungal conditions of the feet. They prepared the root as a long-simmered decoction drunk in small amounts over several days. The specificity of that protocol matters because modern analysis shows the primary active constituents, including methyl-eugenol and certain terpene alcohols, require sustained low-level dosing to produce their antimicrobial effect. Research published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology confirmed significant activity against Staphylococcus aureus and Candida albicans in standardized extracts. To use it today, dried roots simmered for 20 minutes in water makes the traditional preparation, and the liquid can also be used as a topical rinse for skin conditions. Yerba mansa never entered mainstream American pharmacology because it grows in a narrow ecological range and was difficult to commercialize at scale. It remained a borderland medicine known only to those who lived near the water channels where it thrives. It is one of the most quietly effective plants this continent ever produced. Wild bergamot, also called Monarda fistulosa, was used by the Ojibwe to treat respiratory congestion, fevers, and skin conditions. They prepared a steam inhalation by dropping fresh leaves onto hot stones and breathing the vapor directly, a method remarkably similar to modern aromatic therapy protocols. Here is what is fascinating. The primary volatile compound in wild bergamot is thymol, the same molecule that gives commercial antiseptic mouthwashes their active power. Research from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health has documented thymol's significant antibacterial action against oral pathogens and respiratory tract bacteria. The Blackfoot used wild bergamot leaf preparations differently as a topical application for acne and infected skin, which makes sense given thymol's documented ability to penetrate lipid membranes of gram-positive bacteria. Fresh or dried leaves steeped as a tea remain the simplest preparation today. Wild bergamot disappeared from American medicine in part because thymol was eventually synthesized and could be produced cheaply at scale, making the plant itself commercially unnecessary. But the synthesized version lacks the dozens of secondary compounds that make the whole plant preparation more complex in its action. A medicine reduced to one compound is rarely the same thing as the original. Usnea is a lichen that grows on the bark of conifers across North America, and many nations, including the Potawatomi, used it to pack wounds and stop bleeding. They recognized that wounds packed with Usnea healed more cleanly than unpacked ones, a clinical observation that predates germ theory by centuries. Modern mycology has explained this precisely. Usnic acid, the primary compound in Usnea, disrupts the oxidative phosphorylation pathway in bacterial cells, which is a fundamentally different mechanism than most antibiotics, meaning it works on many strains that have developed resistance to conventional treatment. A 2012 study in phytotherapy research confirmed activity against both gram-positive bacteria and several fungal pathogens at concentrations achievable with topical application. Usnea tincture, made from fresh lichen in high-proof alcohol, is considered the most effective modern preparation for both internal and topical use. It faded from Western medicine partly because lichens are notoriously slow-growing and impossible to farm, which made standardization and commercial supply impractical. Usnea did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the world it had supplied did not survive industrialization intact. Osha root grows in the high mountain meadows of the Rockies, and the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico considered it among their most sacred medicines. They used it for respiratory illness, carrying dried root as a preventive talisman and burning it in ceremony to clear the air of a dwelling where sickness had been present. The Zuni name for Osha translates roughly to bear root, because bears were observed digging and chewing it after emerging from hibernation, an ethological observation that informed human use. Clinical research has identified compounds called phthalides and ferulic acid in Osha root, both of which have demonstrated bronchodilatory and antiviral properties in cell culture studies. The root is traditionally prepared as a strong decoction drunk hot, and the steam itself is considered medicinal for sinus and bronchial congestion. Osha remains unavailable in most pharmacies because it cannot be cultivated commercially. It grows only at elevations above 8,000 feet in wild conditions that no agricultural system has successfully replicated. That scarcity has kept it rare, but it has also kept it pure. A plant that refuses to be domesticated has a dignity all its own. Now, before we get to number 7, I want to ask you to hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that people are genuinely interested in this kind of ancestral knowledge. That matters because this type of content rarely gets pushed unless the community behind it is loud about supporting it. Subscribe if you have not already, and ring that notification bell so you catch every video we put out on traditional plant medicine and the science that is finally validating it. Spilanthes, called toothache plant, was used by the Potawatomi and the Menominee, who chewed the flower head directly for dental pain and gum infections. The numbing sensation begins within seconds of contact, a pharmacological effect so reliable that early French trappers in the Great Lakes region recorded adopting the practice after watching Menominee healers use it. The compound responsible is spilenthol, a potent alkylamide that activates and then desensitizes pain receptors in a mechanism parallel to capsaicin. Research from the University of Illinois has confirmed that spilanthol shows anti-inflammatory activity in macrophage cell lines and inhibits the growth of Candida albicans at relatively low concentrations. Fresh flower heads chewed slowly are the traditional and most effective preparation. Spilanthes disappeared from the mainstream American dental toolkit in the early 20th century as commercial Novocaine became widely available. It was simply outcompeted by a synthetic molecule that could be standardized, mass-produced, and invoiced. But Novocaine does not fight infection. Spilanthes does both. That asymmetry is worth sitting with. Pipsissewa, also called prince's pine, was used by the Cree and the Ojibwe to treat urinary tract infections, kidney stones, and chronic joint pain. The Cree prepared a tea from the dried leaves and drank it for days at a stretch during kidney illness, an extended use protocol that reflects a sophisticated understanding of how slowly the plant's compounds move through renal tissue. Modern phytochemistry has identified chimaphilin and arbutin in Pipsissewa. Arbutin is hydrolyzed in the body to hydroquinone, which exerts direct antibacterial activity in the acidified urine of the lower urinary tract. A study published in Phytomedicine documented significant inhibition of gram-negative uropathogens, including Escherichia coli, by standardized Pipsissewa extracts. The traditional preparation is a gentle simmer of dried leaves for 15 minutes, drunk unsweetened in small cups throughout the day. It faded from American pharmacology partly because arbutin was identified and extracted for use in a more concentrated synthetic form, making the whole plant economically redundant. Pipsissewa never got a fair hearing as a complete medicine. It was mined for one compound and then set aside, which is how most traditional plants were treated once pharmaceutical chemistry learned what to look for inside them. Stillingia root was used by the Seminole and Cherokee as a blood purifier, a category of medicine that Western pharmacology long dismissed as vague and unscientific. They prepared long, slow decoctions of the root and used it specifically for skin conditions, lymphatic swelling, and persistent low-grade fevers. Here is what most people miss. Blood purifier is a functionally accurate description of what the plant does, even if it sounds archaic. Research has identified diterpenoids and stillingene compounds in Stillingia root that show measurable effects on lymphocyte activity and hepatic detoxification pathways. A study from the Bastyr University Research Program documented anti-proliferative activity in certain cell lines and noted the plant's historical use in the eclectic medical tradition of the 19th century, when American physicians used it extensively before pharmaceutical consolidation. The root is traditionally prepared as a long-simmered decoction, never a quick tea because the active resins require extended heat to become bioavailable. Stillingia was effectively erased from American medicine when the eclectic school of practice was defunded and closed in the early 20th century, a deliberate institutional consolidation that favored pharmaceutical chemistry over botanical practice. What the Seminole knew for generations was simply reclassified as folklore. Sweetgrass holds ceremonial importance across many plains and eastern woodland nations, but its medicinal use is less well known outside ethnobotanical literature. The Abenaki and Cree used sweetgrass smoke to treat headaches and anxiety, and prepared cool infusions of the dried grass for washing infected wounds. The primary compound coumarin, which gives sweetgrass its characteristic vanilla-like scent, has been studied by researchers at the University of Mississippi's National Center for Natural Products Research, who documented anti-inflammatory activity through inhibition of prostaglandin synthesis. Coumarin also shows anxiolytic properties in rodent models at physiologically relevant concentrations, which gives the ceremonial use of sweetgrass smoke a pharmacological foundation that most observers had never considered. Today, dried sweetgrass can be brewed as a light tea for its coumarin content. Though traditional preparations vary widely by nation, sweetgrass did not enter mainstream medicine largely because coumarin in high doses is hepatotoxic, which led to regulatory restriction of food-grade coumarin in the 1950s. That restriction was applied broadly enough to shadow the whole plant in clinical contexts, even though the traditional doses used by indigenous healers were far below any threshold of concern. Caution is wise, conflation is not. Lobelia was called pukeweed by early American settlers who observed Native American emetic practices, and the name stuck long enough to obscure a genuinely complex medicine. The Cherokee used lobelia for respiratory spasm, asthma-like conditions, and muscle tension, preparing the dried leaf as a tea in very small amounts. Samuel Thompson, the 19th century botanical physician, borrowed lobelia practice directly from Cherokee healers and built an entire school of medicine around it. The active compound lobeline acts on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in a way that relaxes bronchial smooth muscle, which is exactly what traditional respiratory use described. Research published in the Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics has explored lobeline as a potential intervention for nicotine addiction because of this receptor affinity. The plant requires careful dosing because the therapeutic window between effective bronchodilation and emetic effect is narrow, which is exactly why traditional Cherokee use involved small measured doses. Lobelia was banned from practice in several American states in the 19th century after Thompson's followers created a populist medical movement that threatened the physician class economically. It was not removed because it was dangerous at traditional doses. It was removed because it was free and available to everyone, which made it politically inconvenient. Red clover was used by the Iroquois for respiratory congestion, the Potawatomi for skin conditions, and multiple Eastern nations for menopausal symptoms in a way that modern endocrinology has only recently explained. The blossoms were prepared as tea and drunk daily over extended periods by women in midlife, a practice recorded in the Mormon database of Native American ethnobotany. The reason this works is that red clover contains isoflavones, specifically formononetin and biochanin A, which are phytoestrogens that bind weakly to estrogen receptors. A clinical trial published in Gynecological Endocrinology found that standardized red clover isoflavone supplementation reduced hot flash frequency by approximately 40% compared to placebo over 12 weeks. Fresh or dried blossoms steeped as tea remain the most traditional preparation, and the daily cumulative effect builds over weeks of consistent use. Red clover was never banned or actively suppressed. It simply became invisible when hormone replacement therapy emerged in the 1960s as a pharmaceutical solution that could be prescribed, dosed, and billed. The women of the Iroquois Confederacy had already solved this problem with a meadow flower. They just did not have a patent on it. Sarsaparilla, native to the southeastern United States and used by the Creeks and Seminole, was one of the most traded botanical medicines of the 19th century before it was reduced to a flavoring agent in soft drinks. Creek healers prepared long root decoctions for joint inflammation, skin eruptions, and what they described as conditions caused by the blood carrying too much heat. Research has identified steroidal saponins in sarsaparilla root, including sarsasapogenin and smilagenin, which have demonstrated anti-inflammatory activity by modulating cytokine production in macrophage studies. A paper in the International Journal of Molecular Sciences reviewed the anti-inflammatory and hepatoprotective mechanisms of sarsaparilla saponins and found multiple pathways of confirmed activity. The root is best prepared as a long, slow decoction of at least 40 minutes, as the saponins require extended heat for full extraction. Sarsaparilla faded from medicine when it became famous as a soda flavor, a commercial rebranding that trivialized what Greek healers had understood for generations as a serious medicine for chronic inflammatory conditions. It is almost impossible to reclaim a plant's medicinal authority once it has become associated with a sweet beverage. That is one of the stranger losses in American botanical history. Black cohosh was used by the Cherokee and the Algonquin peoples for menstrual irregularity, labor preparation, and joint pain, with some records from the Haudenosaunee describing use specifically for the pain of rheumatism in older women. The rhizome was prepared as a decoction drunk in measured doses over weeks, never as a single large preparation. Here is what is fascinating. The modern clinical literature on black cohosh is one of the most debated in phytomedicine. Not because the plant does not work, but because researchers initially assumed it was a phytoestrogen and then discovered it is not. It appears to act through serotonergic and dopaminergic pathways instead, which helps explain why it reduces the frequency and intensity of hot flashes without directly mimicking estrogen. A meta-analysis published in the journal Menopause reviewed 16 randomized controlled trials and found consistent positive effects on vasomotor symptoms. The traditional preparation of dried root decoction remains clinically validated at doses equivalent to 40 milligrams of standardized extract daily. Black cohosh entered mainstream American medicine briefly in the 19th century under the commercial name Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, then faded when pharmaceutical estrogen therapy dominated the conversation. It is now experiencing a serious scientific revival. Passion flower was used by the Cherokee for anxiety, insomnia, and what their healers described as a racing or unsettled mind. The whole aerial plant, leaves, stems, and flowers, was prepared as a tea drunk in the evening before sleep, a clinical application so precise that modern pharmacology has confirmed the mechanism in remarkable detail. Research from the University of Texas has identified flavonoids in passion flower, specifically chrysin, that bind to gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors in the same general region as benzodiazepine drugs, though with far less potency and without the dependency effects. A randomized controlled trial published in Phytotherapy Research compared passion flower tea to low-dose oxazepam in adults with generalized anxiety and found comparable anxiety reduction with fewer side effects in the passion flower group. The traditional preparation is a standard hot water infusion of the dried herb, drunk nightly. Passion flower faded from the mainstream American formulary in the mid-20th century, not through active suppression but through pharmaceutical replacement. Every natural remedy that treats anxiety has faced the same commercial displacement. What the Cherokee discovered about the evening mind has taken modern medicine decades to confirm with controlled trials. Boneset was one of the most widely used plants in colonial and pre-colonial North American medicine, with the Iroquois, Delaware, and Menominee all recording its use for the bone-deep aching pain of influenza, which is how the plant got its common name. They prepared it as a strong, hot, bitter tea drunk during the acute phase of fever illness, sometimes with elderberry and yarrow together. Modern research has identified sesquiterpene lactones and immunomodulatory polysaccharides in boneset that stimulate macrophage and natural killer cell activity, which is exactly what a body needs during the first 48 hours of a viral illness. A study from the University of Vienna documented significant cytokine-stimulating effects from standardized boneset extracts in human peripheral blood cell models. The traditional preparation requires the herb to be steeped hot and drunk while still warm, because heat affects the bioavailability of the active lactones. Boneset disappeared from American medicine gradually through the 20th century as symptomatic relief drugs like acetaminophen and ibuprofen became the cultural default for managing fever and flu pain. Those drugs reduce symptoms but do not engage the immune response. Boneset was not managing symptoms. It was calling the immune system to action. Yarrow has been used by more than 50 Native American nations, making it possibly the most universally distributed medicinal plant in North American ethnobotany. The Navajo used it for wound care and fever, the Ojibwe chewed the leaves for toothache, and the Blackfoot prepared root infusions for stomach pain. Roman soldiers carried yarrow into battle under the name Herba Militaris for its wound-staunching properties, and the Plains nations arrived at precisely the same use entirely independently. Acalin and acalikin, sesquiterpene lactones named after the plant's genus Acalea, show documented anti-inflammatory activity by inhibiting NF-κB signaling, which is one of the central pathways in both acute inflammation and chronic inflammatory disease. Research published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology confirmed hemostatic activity from yarrow leaf preparations applied topically, consistent with centuries of wound care use across cultures. Fresh or dried leaves applied directly to bleeding wounds remain the traditional preparation, and hot yarrow tea is the standard fever protocol. Yarrow disappeared not from medicine exactly, but from clinical respect. It became a garden herb, a decorative plant, a thing people grow without knowing what it once stopped. Elderberry was used by the Cherokee to treat respiratory infections and fever, with the berry syrup made by long-simmering the ripe fruit, a preparation that would be entirely recognizable to anyone who has walked down a supplement aisle in the past decade. Here is what most people miss. The Cherokee preparation protocol specifically excluded raw elderberries and required cooked reduction, which is pharmacologically correct because raw elderberries contain cyanogenic glycosides that cooking deactivates. That is not accidental knowledge. That is accumulated clinical wisdom expressed as culinary protocol. Modern research from the Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem, led by Dr. Madeleine Mumkwoglu, documented that standardized elderberry extract reduced influenza duration by an average of 4 days compared to placebo in a double-blind trial. The mechanism involves anthocyanins that bind to and inhibit hemagglutinin, the protein flu viruses used to penetrate respiratory cells. The traditional preparation of cooked berry syrup with honey remains clinically supported. Elderberry is now commercially successful again, which is a genuine good outcome, but most commercial products strip out the seed and skin fractions where the most active anthocyanin concentrations reside. The Cherokee version was more complete. Culver's root was used by the Menominee and the Meskwaki as a liver medicine, prepared from the dried, aged root, as a decoction for what traditional healers described as a sluggish or congested liver condition. The eclectic physicians of the 19th century adopted it enthusiastically and listed it in the United States Dispensatory from 1820 through the early 20th century, one of the clearer cases where mainstream American medicine briefly acknowledged indigenous botanical wisdom before abandoning it. The active compounds leptandrin and veronicastrum glycosides have shown hepatic and choleretic activity in animal models, stimulating bile production and flow in ways consistent with traditional liver cleansing descriptions. Research reviewed in the American Botanical Council's Herbalgram Journal has documented consistent choleretic effects from root preparations across multiple model systems. The dried root must be aged for at least 1 year before preparation, because fresh root contains compounds that produce excessive cathartic activity. The aging protocol was part of Menominee practice from the beginning. Culver's root was removed from the American Pharmacopoeia in 1916 as part of a broad consolidation that favored synthetic drugs over botanicals. It was not removed for ineffectiveness. It was removed for inconvenience. And now number 20, this is the one that, when I first encountered its full history, genuinely stopped me cold. Prairie clover, specifically Dahlia purpurea, was used by the Pawnee, the Ponca, and the Omaha as a wound disinfectant and for the treatment of open infected sores that would not heal. The Omaha healer, Francis Laflèche, in records preserved through the Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 19th century, described preparations made from the dried aerial plant applied as a powder directly into wounds that had resisted other treatment. Here is what makes this extraordinary. Researchers at the University of Nebraska studied prairie clover extracts and identified cytotoxic flavonoids, including petalostomomol and genistein derivatives, that show anti-proliferative activity against certain abnormal cell lines in vitro, in addition to the antimicrobial properties consistent with traditional wound use. The wound application protocol described by Lafleche, using dried powdered plant material packed into non-healing tissue, bears a structural resemblance to modern topical antimicrobial wound dressings in ways that no one in the 19th century would have been equipped to understand scientifically. And yet the Omaha had already arrived there. They had arrived through thousands of careful observations of what worked and what did not. Prairie clover never entered the Western pharmacopoeia. It was observed, recorded by an ethnographer, filed in an archive, and forgotten. What the Pawnee and the Omaha knew about this small purple prairie flower may be one of the most significant, unexamined pieces of indigenous botanical knowledge in North America. The science is not finished with it yet. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you have just learned something extraordinary. Across 20 different plants from dozens of distinct Native American nations, a pattern has emerged that is impossible to ignore. These healers did not guess. They observed, refined, transmitted, and applied botanical knowledge with a clinical precision that modern phytochemistry is still working to fully decode. The compounds that explain these plants, berberine, alkylamides, saponins, phytoestrogens, sesquiterpene lactones, all of them confirm what the Cherokee, the Ojibwe, the Omaha, and dozens of other nations already knew through practice long before a laboratory existed to explain why it worked. If this video changed the way you think about ancestral medicine, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this content reach the people who are searching for it. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Which plant surprised you most today? Was it the prairie clover with its connection to wound treatment science? The passion flower with its link to the same brain receptors as anti-anxiety medication? Or the elderberry, where a Cherokee cooking protocol turned out to be pharmacologically correct in ways no one understood for centuries? Tell me below. Subscribe if you are not already part of this community, because we go deep on this material every single time. The plants were always there. The knowledge was always there. What we are doing now is remembering.